The rain hadn't stopped in 2 days. It fell in sheets over the city, turning the sidewalks into rivers and washing away the lines between the rich and the poor, at least for a moment. On a cracked corner of Maple and 7th, where the world seemed to forget people existed, sat a boy no older than 15. His hoodie was 3 sizes too big. His sneakers had holes in the soles, and his eyes, dark and focused, watched the world with a strange kind of clarity. His name was Eli. Eli was a fixture there, barely noticed by the people who passed him each day. Briefcases in hand, faces buried in phones, too busy chasing something to notice the boy who watched everything. They called him a beggar. Some called him a pest. None of them knew he listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, it was never nonsense. That morning, just after the rain had slowed to a whisper, a black SUV with tinted windows pulled up to the curb. The man who stepped out was tall, polished, and clearly used to being the most important person in any room. His name was Martin Rowe, a self-made millionaire, known in business circles as relentless and in social ones as untouchable. But today he looked lost. He paced near the corner, phone clutched in one hand, his other rubbing the back of his neck like he was trying to ground himself in the chaos of his thoughts. Eli watched him. Then, softly, as if he had been waiting for this moment all along, he stood. "Sir," he said. Martin didn't look at him at first. He heard the voice, dismissed it as street noise. But Eli stepped closer. "Sir, I can make your daughter walk again." The words didn't hit Martin right away. When they did, he froze. For the first time that day, maybe the first time in weeks, he looked up from the ground and straight into someone else's eyes. The boy's stare didn't waver. "What did you say?" Martin asked, his voice low, cautious. Eli nodded. "Your daughter. I can help her." Martin took a step back. How did this kid, this nobody, know about his daughter? About the accident? About the wheelchair? Panic rippled through him, quickly followed by something else. Anger. "Who told you to say that? Is this some kind of sick joke?" he barked. Eli didn't flinch. He simply said, "I don't need to know her name. I saw her. In a dream. You were beside her, crying. She couldn't move. But I can help." There was a silence so thick it wrapped around them both. For a moment, all Martin could hear was the distant rush of cars and the blood in his ears. Then he shook his head and turned back to his SUV. "Get lost, kid." But he didn't forget those eyes. Martin tried to shake the encounter. He told himself it was nothing. Just a street kid fishing for attention, maybe money. But the image of those eyes followed him back to the hospital, into the sterile white hallway where his daughter, Lila, lay under soft lights and quiet machines. She was 13, too young to carry the kind of pain she did in her eyes. The accident had crushed part of her spine, and doctors said she might never walk again. Physical therapy, they insisted. Hope, time. But they never used the word promise, and that was what Martin craved. Certainty. Eli had used that word. Promise. That night, Martin didn't sleep. He sat in the leather chair by Lila's bed, watching the rise and fall of her chest, wondering how a stranger, let alone a homeless boy, could claim something doctors wouldn't dare. By morning, curiosity gave way to obsession. He went back to the corner where Eli had been. It was still raining, though softer now, like the sky was tired. Martin waited. An hour passed. 2. People came and went. But no Eli. Just as Martin was about to leave, a soft voice spoke from behind him. "You came back." Martin turned. There he was. Same oversized hoodie. Same calm eyes. "What do you want from me?" Martin asked. "Nothing," Eli replied. "But you want something. A miracle. And I can give it." Martin narrowed his eyes. "What are you? Some kind of healer? A con artist?" Eli smiled, but it wasn't mocking. It was patient. "I'm just someone who listens. To the world. To people. Sometimes to things others can't hear." Martin laughed bitterly. "You sound insane." "Maybe. But insanity is just a word for what people don't understand yet." Silence. Then Eli said, "Bring her to me. 1 hour. Here." Martin hesitated. Every part of him said no. Every logical bone in his body screamed that this was madness. But something else whispered, What if? An hour later, the SUV rolled back onto the same street, drawing stares from passing strangers. The car door opened slowly. Martin stepped out, this time more composed, but his eyes were tired. In the back seat, Lila sat hunched in her wheelchair, arms folded over her chest, face blank. She hadn't spoken much since the accident, just enough to let them know the pain hadn't gone anywhere. Eli stood in the same spot, as if he hadn't moved in weeks, as if he belonged to that corner in a way no one else ever could. He walked toward the girl without hesitation. Martin moved to block him. "Not too close," he said instinctively. Eli paused. "I won't hurt her." Lila lifted her eyes for the first time and stared at the boy. Something about him made her blink like she'd seen him before. Maybe in a dream. Maybe in a memory. She couldn't place it. "May I?" Eli asked, his hand hovering over hers. Martin looked at Lila. She gave the faintest nod. Eli knelt beside her, his fingers gently resting on her palm. He closed his eyes. For a moment nothing happened. The street sounds grew louder. A bus rumbled by. A dog barked from somewhere. Martin felt his chest tighten. This was stupid, reckless, desperate. Then Lila gasped. It wasn't dramatic, just a sudden intake of breath like she'd been underwater and just reached the surface. Eli didn't move, but Lila's eyes widened. "I felt something," she whispered. Martin rushed to her side. What did you feel?" She blinked. "Warmth. In my legs. It's gone now. But I felt it." Eli finally stood. "It's beginning. I'll need 3 days. No more, no less. Bring her here each day. Same time." Martin stared at him. "Who are you, really?" "Someone who knows pain, and how to listen to it." He turned and walked away, disappearing into the mist that had begun to rise from the pavement. The second day, the rain stopped. The air was still damp, but the city felt lighter somehow, as if it, too, was waiting for something. Martin arrived early, Lila bundled in a warm coat, still quiet but less withdrawn. There was a glow to her cheeks Martin hadn't seen in months. Eli appeared without warning, like he'd stepped out of the cracks in the sidewalk. He approached silently, nodded to Lila, then sat cross-legged in front of her. His hands hovered near her knees. "There's more today," he said. "You may cry. That's okay." Martin bristled, but Lila only nodded. The session was different. There was no ceremony, no words spoken, just stillness, a kind of reverent silence that wrapped around them like a bubble. Lila's hands gripped the armrests of her chair. Her eyes shut tight. Then the tears came, not from pain but from memory. She began whispering things, snippets of conversations, songs, smells, moments lost to the crash. Eli listened to it all, never interrupting. When she opened her eyes again, her fingers trembled. She looked at her father. "I moved my toe. I think I moved it." Martin dropped to his knees. "Are you sure?" She nodded slowly, as if afraid the moment would vanish if she moved too quickly. Eli stood. "One more day, but be ready. Tomorrow, she stands." Martin couldn't breathe. Part of him still doubted. The other part, the one that had been silent for so long, was starting to hope. The morning of the third day felt different. The city was quiet in a way that didn't make sense. Even the birds held their breath. Martin barely spoke during the ride, and Lila stared out the window, her fingers twitching now and then as if testing their connection to the world. She looked different, lighter, stronger, not just in body but in spirit. Eli was already there, sitting on the curb like he was waiting for the last page of a story to be written. As the SUV stopped, he stood without a word and motioned for them to come closer. "Are you ready?" he asked Lila. She nodded, her lips trembling. Martin stood behind her, hands on the wheelchair's handles, afraid to believe, afraid not to. Eli knelt in front of her again. He placed his hands gently on her knees and closed his eyes. The silence that followed was deafening. Every sound in the city seemed to vanish. No honks, no chatter, just stillness. Then, without warning, Lila gasped again, but this time louder. Her whole body tensed. Her fingers clenched the chair's armrests. Her head tilted back. "I can feel them," she whispered. "My legs. I can really feel them." Martin leaned forward. "Try. Just try." Eli stepped back, his eyes never leaving hers. Lila placed her hands on the armrests, braced herself, and slowly, so slowly, it looked like time stopped. She lifted herself. Her legs shook violently, her face twisted with effort. But she stood, wobbly, shaking, but standing. Martin let out a sound that was half laughter, half sob. He fell to his knees again, arms out, unsure whether to grab her or let her have the moment on her own. Lila took one step, then another. Martin was crying now, full body trembling. He looked at Eli. "How did you?" Eli only smiled. "You asked what I am. I'm just someone who never stopped believing. Not in miracles, in people." And then he turned and walked away, just like that. By the time Mr. Halberd found them in the courtyard, Amelia was sitting upright on a bench, with Elijah kneeling in front of her. The moonlight made her look ghostly pale, but her eyes were wide, alive, full of something that had been long buried, hope. Elijah wasn't touching her, but he was whispering, his lips trembling with emotion, his hands extended in reverence, as though he were holding her spirit in his palms. "What are you doing to my daughter?" Halberd's voice cracked like a whip through the silence. His eyes weren't filled with rage this time. They were filled with something deeper, terror. Elijah stood slowly, not in defiance, but like a man who knew he was about to be crushed under something greater than himself. "I'm not doing anything," he said. "She's doing it herself." The old man marched forward and grabbed Elijah by the collar, shoving him hard against a stone column. "You've had your fun. This ends now. I want you out of here before the sun comes up. And if you ever speak to her again, I'll make sure you rot where you started, on the street." Elijah didn't fight back. He didn't even blink. He looked Halberd in the eye and said, "She stood today, with help, but she stood." Halberd's grip faltered. She felt something in her legs. Her body remembered. "Even if her mind's not ready, her soul is. But if you send me away now, she may never believe again. And belief is the only thing that's stronger than pain." The words clung to the air like smoke. Amelia's breathing was shallow, and her eyes darted between the two men. Something in her wanted to scream, but the silence had always been her armor. Halberd released Elijah without another word and walked away, disappearing into the mansion like a ghost ashamed of its own presence. Elijah spent that night sitting outside her room, back against the wall, knees drawn to his chest. He didn't sleep. He barely blinked. He thought of all the broken things in the world, bones, promises, people, and how some things didn't need to be mended. They needed to be reborn. In the morning, she opened the door. Her eyes were swollen, her lips dry, but she looked at him like he was something not of this earth. Not because he had healed her, but because he hadn't given up when she would have. "You're still here," she whispered. "I said I would be. You're not afraid?" "I'm terrified, but you're worth it." They spent the next weeks in secrecy. No doctors, no therapists, just Elijah and Amelia, and a belief growing between them like fire beneath the surface of dry earth. He didn't give her medicine or science. He gave her metaphors. He told her that her legs were asleep, not dead, that they needed to be spoken to gently, like a child who'd been hiding under the bed too long. He placed candles on the floor and asked her to reach them. He painted colors on her toes and asked her to describe them. He had her scream at her legs in frustration and sing lullabies to them at night. Each strange exercise broke something open in her. She felt things, tingling, heat, weakness, sometimes pain. Elijah told her that pain wasn't the enemy. It was the alarm clock for waking limbs. And one day, while balancing her between his arms in the garden, something shifted. Her foot moved. Only an inch. Only a tremor. But it was hers. She collapsed into his arms sobbing, and he held her, trembling himself. Neither said a word. There was nothing to say. A world had changed in that tiny moment. But in the shadows of the estate, Mr. Halberd watched. And his face wasn't filled with wonder. It was filled with dread. Because the man who had everything, the empire, the staff, the board members, the wealth, was powerless in the face of the one thing he couldn't buy, hope. And the beggar, the one he thought beneath them all, had become the gatekeeper to his daughter's soul. I hadn't returned to that house in years. Not since the funeral, not since the final argument with my aunt. Not since the door slammed behind me like the closing of a chapter one swore I'd never reopen. But life has a twisted sense of timing. Now, here I was, standing in front of the creaking porch of my childhood home, the place where silence had always screamed louder than words. The house was colder than I remembered, both literally and in spirit. Dust hung in the air like time had stopped breathing. Every step I took stirred up old ghosts, photographs curled from the edges of forgotten frames, toys half buried under a blanket of memories, and the unmistakable smell of aging wood and something else, like sorrow trapped in the walls. I didn't know what I was looking for exactly. Maybe closure, maybe answers, maybe just a reason for why things happened the way they did. The attic called to me in that strange way places from the past sometimes do, holding secrets we aren't sure we want to uncover. Climbing the stairs felt like walking into the past barefoot, every creak beneath me echoing my hesitation. I pushed open the attic door, half expecting cobwebs and shadows. What I found instead was dust-covered chaos. Boxes upon boxes of things no one had touched in years. I searched blindly at first, like grief was guiding my hands more than logic. Then I saw it. A metal box, burned slightly along one edge, as if it had survived a fire that never reached its heart. My breath caught as I lifted the lid. Inside were letters, dozens of them, some addressed to no one, some to me, all written in my mother's careful, looping handwriting. Hands trembling, I unfolded the top letter. My sweet child, if you're reading this, then something I feared has come to pass. There are things I never had the strength to tell you when I was alive. Please don't hate me for the silence. I was trying to protect you from the same pain that lived inside me every single day. Tears blurred the ink as I read on. She spoke of secrets too heavy for a child to carry, of a man she once loved who vanished long before I was born, of a family torn apart by betrayal, shame, and fear. She wrote about my father, someone I had never met, someone she claimed had loved us but was forced to leave. Her words painted a picture of a woman torn between truth and survival, between love and self-destruction. I turned the photo down because it was the only way I could function, she admitted. If I looked at his face too long, I'd remember the promise he made and broke. But I never stopped loving him. And I never stopped hoping you'd understand one day. I clutched the letter to my chest like it could stop my heart from shattering. My whole life I'd hated her for hiding things, for making me feel like a stranger in my own home. And now I realized she'd been hiding not out of malice, but out of a desperate kind of love, the kind that sacrifices truth to shield a child from pain. The next letter was dated 3 weeks before her death. I don't know how much time I have left. Every morning I wake up hoping I'll find the courage to speak to you, but my voice fails me as it always has. So I write. I pour myself into these pages in the hope that someday you'll forgive me. Not just for what I said, but for everything I never said. There was something gut-wrenching about hearing her voice through ink and paper, as if the words reached across the grave to cradle my face in her hands. As I read more, the truth came into focus. My father hadn't abandoned us. He'd tried to fight for us. But his family, powerful, cold, and prideful, had threatened everything he held dear. And she, in her fear and pride, pushed him away before he could risk more. The love between them had been real. It had just been buried under layers of fear, silence, and time. I spent the whole night in that attic, reading every single letter, every single confession. With each page, the puzzle pieces of my life finally began to align. The rage I'd held onto for so long softened into something else. Grief, yes, but also understanding. She hadn't been perfect, but she had been human. And sometimes being human means failing the ones you love in the name of trying to save them. By dawn, I walked out of that attic not as the wounded child who had once slammed the door behind her, but as a woman finally holding the full story in her hands. The story of a mother who had broken, yes, but who had also loved in her own quiet, self-destructive way. I stood in the backyard and lit a small fire in the rusted metal bin where she used to burn old mail. But I didn't burn the letters. I burned the silence. I whispered every truth she'd hidden into the flames and let them rise like smoke into the morning air. The days that followed were heavy with a strange mix of relief and confusion. I had finally peeled back the layers of silence that had clouded my past, but the answers only opened new questions. Who was I really? What did it mean to carry the blood of a man I never met? And most importantly, could I forgive my mother for the life she chose to hide from me? I wandered through my routine as if I were a ghost, watching myself from the outside, trying to piece together an identity that no longer felt mine. The city buzzed around me, indifferent to my inner turmoil, its noise a constant reminder that life moved on, regardless of the secrets it held. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I found myself standing on the edge of the river that sliced through town. The water moved steadily, relentless, like the memories I could no longer hold back. I pulled the letters from my pocket once again, their edges softened by time, and read through the familiar words one last time. The ache in my chest was both unbearable and necessary, a catharsis that seemed to wash over me in waves. It was here, by the water, that I made a silent vow to find Samuel, the man who had shaped my life in absence. I didn't know if he was alive, or if he even wanted to be found, but I needed to try. The days turned into weeks as I pored over old records, reached out to distant relatives, and followed every faint lead with desperate hope. Each dead end crushed me a little, but I clung to the fragments of truth like a lifeline. In a quiet cafe tucked away from the city's chaos, I met an elderly woman who had known my mother long ago. Her eyes were kind but weary, and when I showed her the photo, her hands trembled. "He was a good man," she said softly, "but the world around them was not kind. You have to understand. Sometimes love is the hardest thing to hold on to." She told me stories of a young couple torn apart by circumstance and fear, of whispered promises broken beneath the weight of expectation. Listening, I felt my own story weave into theirs, a tapestry of pain, resilience, and hope. One night, a call came from a number I didn't recognize. The voice on the other end was cautious but familiar. "I hear you're looking for me," he said simply. My heart skipped. "Yes," I replied, voice barely above a whisper. "I need to know who you are. I need to understand." There was a pause, then a breath. "It's time we talk." The conversation that followed was raw and halting. He told me of his regrets, his mistakes, and the love that never died despite everything. We spoke for hours, piecing together the parts of a story that had been fractured for decades. Though miles apart, I felt a connection that defied years of silence. In that moment, I realized that identity isn't just the sum of blood and history. It's the stories we tell ourselves, the bridges we build over broken pasts, and the courage to embrace the unknown. My journey was far from over, but for the first time I wasn't alone. The days after that phone call felt like waking up from a long, restless sleep. I was no longer trapped in the dark corridors of unanswered questions. Instead, I was stepping cautiously into a new world, a world where the past and present collided, and where the truth was no longer something to fear but something to embrace. Samuel and I kept talking, slowly unraveling the threads that bound us together, despite decades of absence. His voice was rough but sincere, carrying the weight of years spent in regret and longing. We shared stories of our separate lives, the joys and sorrows, the mistakes and lessons learned. Each conversation chipped away the walls I had built around my heart, replacing them with fragile hope. But meeting him in person was still a daunting thought. How do you face someone who was a stranger your whole life, yet holds the key to your identity? The questions buzzed relentlessly in my mind. Yet, beneath the fear, a deeper longing urged me forward. I wanted to see him, to look into his eyes and see if I could find the reflection of myself. Weeks passed before we finally agreed to meet. A small cafe in the city, neutral ground, where the noise of strangers could drown out the awkwardness of reunion. When I arrived, My hands trembled despite my best efforts to steady them. He was already there, sitting alone by the window, a man aged by time but with eyes that sparkled with recognition. As I approached, memories of my mother's letters flooded back. Her words, her hopes, her fears, all converging in this moment. We greeted each other with tentative smiles, unsure how to bridge the decades of silence. Our conversation began haltingly, like strangers trying to find a common language. But slowly, stories spilled out, tears came, and laughter bubbled unexpectedly. He told me of his youth, the battles he fought within and without, and the reasons he left. I shared my own journey, the confusion, the pain, the moments of discovery. In the quiet between words, we found understanding. Meeting Samuel was not the end of the story. It was a new beginning. Together, we faced the ghosts of our pasts and built a fragile but genuine connection. I realized that identity is a living thing, shaped not only by blood but by the choices we make, the truths we face, and the love we allow ourselves to receive. As I walked home that evening, the city lights seemed different, less harsh, more welcoming. I wasn't just a person searching for answers anymore. I was someone ready to write the next chapter of her life, with a past no longer hidden in shadows but embraced as part of who I am. The journey ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, I felt whole. The weeks that followed our reunion unfolded like the slow, deliberate turning of a fragile page. Samuel and I began weaving together not only our stories but our lives, cautiously exploring the terrain of a relationship neither of us had dared to imagine before. There was an awkwardness, of course, the kind that comes from two strangers trying to fill decades of absence with conversation. We learned each other's rhythms, discovered the small details that make a person real. The way he laughed when recalling a forgotten joke, how his hands trembled when he spoke of loss, the quiet pauses that revealed more than words ever could. I realized that the man who had been a mystery for so long was, in truth, as flawed and hopeful as I was. In the meantime, the shadow of my mother's silence loomed large. Her diary remained my guide and my confession, a constant reminder that love and pain are often inseparable. I found myself writing my own thoughts, crafting letters I would never send, grappling with forgiveness. Not just for her, but for myself. Samuel and I attended therapy sessions, tentative steps toward healing the wounds left by years of silence and separation. It was awkward, frustrating, and sometimes painful, but it was also necessary. We learned that rebuilding trust is not a linear path but a winding journey with setbacks and breakthroughs. There were moments of doubt, of anger, and of overwhelming sadness. But there were also moments of joy, shared meals, quiet walks in the park, laughter that filled the empty spaces of our hearts. Through it all, I discovered that identity is not a fixed point but a mosaic, each shard reflecting pieces of the past, present, and future. As my relationship with Samuel deepened, so did my understanding of myself. I began to see my mother not as a woman who abandoned secrets but as someone who carried burdens too heavy to share. And in forgiving her, I found the strength to forgive myself for the anger that had once consumed me. The city around us continued its relentless pace, but inside me, a slow transformation was underway. The pain remained, but it no longer defined me. Instead, it became the soil from which new growth could emerge. One afternoon, Samuel and I visited the river where I had once made my vow to find him. We sat on the bank, watching the water flow endlessly. He reached out and took my hand, a simple gesture that spoke volumes. "We can't change the past," he said softly, "but we can build something new, together." And in that moment, I understood that the story was far from over. It was just beginning. Even with the fragile new bond between us, shadows from the past refused to vanish quietly. There were nights when the silence between Samuel and me screamed louder than any words ever could. The ghosts of broken promises and years lost whispered in every corner, testing our fragile hope. I found myself wondering if healing was just a beautiful illusion, something we desperately wanted but that reality would never allow. One evening, after a rare argument sparked by an old wound neither of us wanted to touch, I walked alone through the rain-soaked streets. The city's cold glow seemed to reflect the storm inside me. My mind raced with questions I couldn't answer. Could I truly forgive? Could I ever trust again? And most terrifyingly, did I even know who I was anymore? The rain blurred the city lights into streaks of color, like a world dissolving before my eyes. I stopped by a quiet park, the place where I had once come to find peace, and sat on a bench dripping wet. As I stared at the puddles reflecting the sky, memories flooded me. The laughter of childhood, my mother's quiet strength, the ache of absence. I realized that the identity I sought wasn't a destination but a constant struggle between the light and dark within. The next day, Samuel found me there. He didn't say much, just sat beside me, sharing the silence. Sometimes, words aren't needed to bridge a gap that feels impossible to cross. Slowly, we learn to face our fears together, to speak the truths that hurt and heal. We began to share our deepest regrets and hopes, pieces of ourselves we'd locked away for too long. Samuel confessed the pain of watching me grow up from afar, the weight of his mistakes heavy on his shoulders. I shared my anger, my loneliness, and the unexpected hope that bloomed despite it all. One afternoon, he brought out an old photo album, worn at the edges but rich with stories. As we flipped through the pages, I saw a side of him I hadn't known, boyish laughter, dreams yet to be broken, moments of tenderness with my mother. It humanized him in ways letters never could. In return, I shared my own memories, the fragmented snapshots of a life lived in half-truths. Our conversations became the threads weaving a tapestry of connection. We made plans, not grand promises, but small steps toward a future neither of us dared to imagine before. Walks in the park, dinners shared, moments where laughter returned, soft and hesitant but genuine. Yet, the past still lurked, waiting to test us. One day, a stranger appeared at my door, a man claiming to know secrets about my mother's past, offering truths that could either heal or shatter everything. The weight of choice pressed down on me. Was I ready to face yet another layer of truth? Or would it undo the fragile peace we had begun to build? As I stood at this crossroads, I realized that life's journey isn't about finding perfect answers, but about courage, the courage to face the unknown, to forgive imperfectly, and to keep moving forward even when the path is dark. With Samuel by my side, I felt a strength I hadn't known I possessed. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, uncertainty didn't terrify me. It invited me to write my own story, not bound by secrets or silence, but by the truth I chose to live. The stranger's visit unsettled everything. His eyes held a weight of secrets, and the envelope he handed me felt heavier than any truth I'd carried so far. Inside were letters, unsigned, fragmentary, but filled with a bitterness that cut through my fragile peace like a blade. They hinted at betrayals my mother never spoke of, at choices made in shadows to protect or to punish, and at a family web tangled far beyond what I'd imagined. I spent days turning the words over in my mind, wrestling with the urge to bury them and the desperate need to understand. Samuel was my anchor during that storm. When the past threatened to swallow me whole, he held my hand, reminding me that my worth wasn't defined by the mistakes of others. Together, we sifted through the pain, determined to find clarity rather than chaos. Slowly, a new picture emerged, not perfect, but real. A story of flawed people, love battered by fear and circumstance, and a daughter trying to piece together a shattered legacy. In the process, I learned the power of forgiveness, not as forgetting, but as choosing peace over bitterness. It was the hardest lesson, one that tore at my soul but freed me in ways I never expected. With every truth faced and every fear confronted, the woman I was becoming grew stronger, more whole. The relationship with Samuel deepened into something neither of us had dared hope for, a tentative family reborn from the ashes of silence. We didn't erase the past. We learned to carry it with grace, transforming pain into connection. And as I looked toward the future, I realized that my story wasn't just about uncovering secrets. It was about creating new ones, stories of resilience, love, and hope that would outlive the shadows of yesterday. With the storm of revelations beginning to settle, I found myself standing on the edge of something unfamiliar. Hope. It wasn't a sudden, blinding light but a gentle glow, like the first rays of dawn cutting through a long, cold night. The weight of the past still pressed on me, but it no longer crushed my spirit. Instead, it became a part of the foundation I was building, a foundation forged in pain, but tempered by understanding. Samuel and I spent more time together, exploring not only who we were but who we might become. We talked about everything. Dreams we had shelved, fears we still carried, and the fragile thread of trust we were weaving between us. It was a delicate dance, full of missteps and apologies, but with each step, we moved closer to something real. One afternoon, we took a trip to the river where I had once made a vow to find him. The water flowed steady and sure, indifferent to the turmoil it had witnessed on its banks. We sat side by side, watching the current swirl, and I realized that, like the river, life moves forward. Sometimes slow, sometimes fast, but always onward. In that quiet moment, I understood that identity isn't just about blood or history. It's about the stories we choose to tell ourselves, the connections we nurture, and the courage to embrace both light and shadow. My journey was far from over, but for the first time, I felt ready to face whatever came next. Not as a lost child searching for answers, but as a woman claiming her own story. That night, as I lay awake, I thought about the photo my mother had hidden, the letters I had found, and the man I had met. I thought about forgiveness, loss, and the strange beauty of second chances. The past would always be a part of me, but it no longer defined me. I was ready to write the next chapter. After the calm that followed the storm, life began to feel like a fragile thread, weaving new patterns across the torn fabric of my past. The truth I had uncovered was no longer a source of pain alone but a guide, a map showing where I'd been and where I might still go. Samuel and I continued to build on the tentative foundation we had laid, learning each other's rhythms, discovering the gaps that years of absence had created, and filling them with shared moments and quiet understanding. It wasn't easy. Old fears and doubts surfaced like ghosts, threatening to pull us back into the darkness we'd escaped. There were days when I wondered if the wounds were too deep to heal, if the distance of time was too vast to bridge. But every time those thoughts crept in, Samuel's presence reminded me that healing is a process, not a destination. We took it one step at a time, sometimes moving forward, sometimes retreating, but always together. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, we found ourselves sitting on the porch of my childhood home. The house looked smaller now, less intimidating. The silence between us was comfortable, a shared space where words weren't always necessary. I realized that home wasn't just a place. It was a feeling, fragile and elusive, but real when shared with someone who understands. We talked about the future, not in grand plans, but in small hopes. A visit to the coast, learning to cook a new recipe, finding joy in the ordinary. It was in these simple dreams that I found strength. I saw that despite the scars of the past, there was room to grow, to love, and to build a life that was mine. At night, I often thought about my mother. Her silence had been a shield, but it had also left a void. I wished I could tell her about the journey I was on, about the man who had become part of my life, and about the forgiveness I was learning to give. Maybe, in some way, she was watching, finally at peace knowing her secrets were no longer shackles but stepping stones. The path ahead was uncertain, filled with unknowns. But for the first time in a long time, uncertainty didn't feel like fear. It felt like possibility. A blank page waiting for the story I was ready to write. The months that followed were a testament to the power of slow healing. Life didn't suddenly become perfect, nor did the shadows of the past vanish entirely, but they no longer held the same grip over my heart. Each day was a careful balance between remembrance and release, a dance between honoring where I came from and embracing where I was going. Samuel and I continued to grow together, navigating the complex web of family and forgiveness. There were times when the weight of unspoken truths threatened to overwhelm us, yet we faced them head-on, learning to communicate beyond words and to trust even when vulnerability felt like a risk. One afternoon, as autumn leaves spiraled down around us, Samuel suggested we visit a small town where he'd spent part of his youth. It was a place of faded memories and forgotten promises, but also a place where some of the hardest chapters of our stories began to heal. Walking through its quiet streets, we shared fragments of our pasts, laughter mingling with tears, as the crisp air carried away some of the heaviness that clung to us. That trip was more than a journey to a place, it was a journey within. I realized that healing isn't a straight path but a series of steps, some forward, some back, that ultimately lead us closer to ourselves. At night, when the world quieted, I found myself writing again. Not letters to the past or confessions hidden in dusty boxes, but stories. Stories of resilience, hope, and the unexpected beauty of broken things coming together. Writing became my refuge, a way to make sense of the chaos inside and to imagine a future unbound by old wounds. Samuel supported me in ways I hadn't anticipated. He became both companion and co-creator of this new chapter, encouraging me to dream beyond the scars and to believe in the possibility of joy. Our relationship deepened, not just through shared history but through the small, everyday moments that build a life together. Cooking meals, late-night talks, quiet mornings watching sunlight spill across the floor. Yet, beneath the peace, there was a growing sense of readiness, an understanding that the past, while a part of us, would not define the whole story. One evening, as we sat by the fireplace, Samuel took my hand and said, "We're not just surviving anymore, we're living." His words settled in my heart like a gentle promise. The journey had been long and winding, filled with pain and discovery, but it had brought me to a place I never thought possible, home. Not just a place, but a feeling, a connection forged in truth and love. As the fire crackled and the night deepened, I knew the road ahead would still hold challenges. But I also knew I was no longer walking it alone. And that made all the difference. With every passing day, the fragile threads that bound Samuel and me grew stronger, weaving a tapestry richer than either of us could have imagined. What started as a tentative reunion had blossomed into a genuine bond, not without struggles, but with a shared commitment to face the unknown together. I found myself reflecting often on the strange twists life had taken. From a childhood shadowed by silence and secrets to this unexpected chapter of connection and healing, my story had become more than a search for answers. It was a testament to resilience. One morning, sunlight streamed through the curtains, casting warm patterns on the floor as I brewed coffee in the quiet kitchen. Samuel entered, his eyes bright despite the weight we both carried. He spoke softly of plans, not grandiose but simple. A trip to the countryside, visits to places untouched by the chaos of our past. These small dreams felt revolutionary to me. They symbolized hope, a reclaiming of life that had once seemed impossible. As we ventured beyond the city's walls, the world opened up in ways I had forgotten. Fields stretched wide beneath endless skies. Birds sang songs that seemed to chase away old sorrows. Together, we wandered, learning to savor the present even as shadows lingered. The past remained a constant companion, but it no longer dictated the rhythm of my heart. During one such trip, we stumbled upon a small library in a quaint town. Inside, dusty shelves held stories waiting to be discovered, much like our own. I ran my fingers along the spines, feeling a kinship with the countless voices that had poured their souls into these pages. It was there I realized that storytelling, sharing our journeys, could be a bridge between pain and understanding. Back home, I began to write openly, weaving my experiences into narratives that resonated beyond my own walls. Samuel became my steadfast editor and encourager, reminding me of the power held in vulnerability. Our relationship deepened through this creative process, a dance of trust and revelation. Yet, life wasn't without its tests. News arrived that forced us to confront past wounds anew. A letter from a distant relative, a reminder that family legacies are often tangled and complex. The old questions resurfaced. Who do we choose to be when the past refuses to stay buried? How do we protect the fragile peace we've built without denying history? We faced these challenges side by side, finding strength in our shared resilience. The journey of healing was ongoing, a mosaic of moments, some joyful, some painful, but each contributing to the woman I was becoming. As twilight settled over the horizon, I understood that identity isn't static. It shifts and grows, shaped by the stories we embrace and the courage we summon to live them. My mother's silence, my father's absence, the secrets unearthed. They were parts of my past, but not the whole of me. With Samuel beside me, I was ready to continue writing my story, one of forgiveness, hope, and the unyielding human spirit. The deeper Samuel and I delved into our shared past, the more I realized that healing wasn't a straight path. It was a winding road paved with moments of grace and setbacks alike. Some days, the weight of what had been lost pressed down so heavily I could barely breathe. Other days, a quiet joy lifted my spirit like a gentle breeze. But through it all, we leaned on each other, discovering new strengths within ourselves and our bond. One chilly morning, as frost glittered on the window panes, Samuel suggested we visit the place where my mother had grown up. A small town nestled among rolling hills, filled with the echoes of old memories. I hesitated at first, unsure if I was ready to face that chapter, but something inside me stirred, a yearning to understand the roots of the silence that had shaped so much of my life. The drive was quiet, save for the soft hum of the engine and the occasional exchange of stories neither of us had shared before. When we arrived, the town greeted us with a faded charm. Weathered houses lined narrow streets, and the scent of pine hung in the crisp air. Walking through the familiar yet foreign landscape, I felt the layers of time peeling away, revealing the tender heart of a woman I thought I knew but was only beginning to understand. We found my mother's childhood home, a modest house with peeling paint and a garden overgrown with wildflowers. Standing there, memories flooded me. Whispered conversations, a mother's quiet strength, the burdens she carried in silence. Samuel squeezed my hand gently, grounding me in the present as the past threatened to overwhelm. That night, under a sky sprinkled with stars, we sat by a crackling fire, sharing stories with neighbors who remembered my mother as a spirited girl, full of dreams and fears. Their words painted a picture of a woman who had loved fiercely, but had been forced to bury her pain deep inside. Hearing their memories was like hearing her voice anew, a voice that had shaped me even in absence. As the firelight danced on our faces, I realized that understanding my mother meant embracing both her strengths and her flaws. It meant forgiving the silence as much as mourning the secrets. And it meant allowing myself to be vulnerable enough to carry her legacy forward, not as a burden, but as a testament to survival. Back home, the layers of my story continued to unfold. Samuel and I faced difficult conversations about identity, about belonging, about the future we wanted to build. Some days were easier than others, but each challenge brought us closer, forging a connection grounded in honesty and hope. Through it all, I learned that the past, no matter how painful, doesn't have to define us, can teach us, shape us, and ultimately set us free. With Samuel by my side, I was no longer a woman fractured by secrets, but one whole enough to embrace the unknown with courage. The road ahead was still uncertain, but I walked it with a heart open to possibility and a spirit ready to write the next chapter of my life. Life after that visit to my mother's childhood home took on a new rhythm. It wasn't that the past suddenly made sense or that the silence was completely lifted. Those things take time, but I began to feel a shift within me, a quiet acceptance that maybe some questions would never have perfect answers. I started to understand that the journey wasn't about finding a neat conclusion but about living with the complexity of my story. Samuel and I continued to navigate this uncertain terrain together, our relationship growing in ways I hadn't expected. We shared small victories, a smile over breakfast, a walk through the park, a shared song on a quiet evening, as well as the harder moments when the weight of years apart seemed to press in. But we faced it all with honesty, recognizing that love is not just about perfect moments but about showing up when things get messy. One afternoon, while sitting in the local library, I found a journal tucked away between the shelves, its cover worn and pages yellowed. It was someone else's story, but the words inside resonated deeply with me. Tales of loss, of hope, of rebuilding after brokenness. I realized that stories like these aren't just personal. They're universal. Every person carries wounds and hopes, secrets and truths. That realization sparked a new determination in me. I began to write my own story more openly, not just for myself but for others who might be searching for their own truth. The act of putting words to paper became a balm, a way to make peace with the past and imagine a future shaped by resilience. Meanwhile, Samuel and I began to dream together in new ways. We talked about travel, about building a home filled with laughter and warmth, about creating traditions that honored both our histories. The past still had its shadows, but those shadows no longer scared me. They were part of the tapestry, woven into the vibrant fabric of a life being rebuilt. One evening, as the sun set in fiery hues over the city skyline, Samuel took my hand and said, "We've come so far, and yet, this is only the beginning." His words echoed the hope I felt swelling inside. A hope grounded not in fantasy but in the real, imperfect journey we were walking. I knew there would be more challenges ahead. The past is never fully behind us. But with Samuel's steady presence and the strength I had found within myself, I felt ready to face whatever came next. The silence that once defined my life had been broken, not by perfect answers, but by the courage to seek them. And in that breaking, I discovered something I never thought possible: peace. The days unfolded with a rhythm that felt both new and strangely familiar. As Samuel and I walked this path together, the past no longer felt like a chain but like a thread woven into a larger tapestry. One that included pain, yes, but also resilience, forgiveness, and hope. I found myself waking each morning with a sense of possibility that had been missing for so long, a quiet assurance that whatever came next, I would face it not as a fractured child but as a woman whole enough to carry her story. We began to create rituals, small but meaningful moments that grounded us amid the uncertainties. Morning coffees shared in silence, walks through quiet neighborhoods where the world seemed slower, and evenings spent reading stories aloud by the fire. These routines became anchors, reminders that life could still be gentle even when the heart carried scars. Through these shared moments, I learned the delicate art of presence, not just existing side by side, but truly seeing and hearing one another. Our conversations deepened, exploring not only the details of our intertwined histories, but also our dreams for the future. We spoke of travels to places neither of us had been, of building a home filled with warmth and laughter, and of creating new memories that would outshine the shadows of the past. There was a tenderness in these exchanges, a sense that healing was not just about confronting pain but also about embracing joy. Yet, the journey was not without its challenges. Sometimes old fears resurfaced unexpectedly. A word, a gesture, a memory that reignited the doubts we thought were long buried. In those moments, we held space for each other's vulnerabilities, recognizing that healing is not a linear path, but a winding road marked by both progress and setbacks. Our commitment to honesty and empathy became the foundation that sustained us through the hardest days. One afternoon, I received a letter from a distant relative I had never met, someone who held pieces of the family history I was still piecing together. Their words offered both comfort and complexity, revealing new layers of the story I thought I knew. It was a reminder that family is never simple, and that the past continues to shape us in ways both visible and unseen. Rather than fear this complexity, I chose to embrace it as part of my evolving identity. In quiet moments alone, I often reflected on how far I had come, from a child lost in silence and secrets to a woman willing to face her past and claim her future. Writing remained my refuge, a way to give voice to the emotions that sometimes felt too big for words. Through storytelling, I connected with others who carried their own burdens, finding strength in shared experience. With Samuel by my side, I felt a growing sense of peace. Not the absence of pain, but the presence of hope. Together, we were not just surviving. We were living, creating a life defined not by the shadows of yesterday but by the light of tomorrow. As the seasons changed, I realized that healing is less about forgetting and more about choosing to move forward with grace. The road ahead remained uncertain, but I no longer feared the unknown. Instead, I embraced it with an open heart, ready to write the next chapter of my life with courage, compassion, and love. The weight of the past had lessened, but its presence still lingered like a familiar shadow, never far, but no longer overwhelming. Samuel and I had settled into a rhythm of life that honored both our histories and the new story we were creating. It was a delicate balance, holding space for grief and joy, forgiveness and memory, endings and beginnings. Every morning, as the sun spilled golden light through the curtains, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. The heavy silence that once wrapped around my life like a thick fog had begun to lift, revealing colors I hadn't seen in years, shades of hope, resilience, and the quiet promise of healing. On a crisp autumn morning, walking through the park where so many meaningful conversations had unfolded, I felt a quiet sense of gratitude. The falling leaves mirrored the cycles of life, endings and new beginnings. Beside me was Samuel, not a flawless savior, but a sincere, imperfect partner who had walked with me through hardship and healing. His presence brought calm to the chaos that once defined my emotional world. We spoke of the future not as a fantasy, but as something within reach. No dramatic promises, just simple hopes. A home filled with love, the mending of broken ties, and the courage to live presently while honoring the past. In that simplicity, I found peace, not the absence of pain, but a kind of earned serenity. Peace, I learned, comes with facing life's trials, not avoiding them. Old wounds still surfaced, triggered by memory or unexpected news. But instead of hiding, Samuel and I chose openness, leaning into hard conversations, meeting each other with vulnerability and honesty. That willingness deepened our bond and redefined intimacy. My mother often came to mind. Her silence once felt like abandonment, but now I understood it as a shield built from love and fear. Forgiving her freed me from resentment, and in that release, I found room to grow. I no longer carried the past as a burden but wore it as part of my story. One evening, beside the fire, Samuel took my hand, and I realized with certainty, my past would always shape me, but it no longer controlled me. I was ready to embrace the unknown with strength, knowing that love and resilience would light the path forward. Vulnerability, I've learned, is not something to fear. It's where real connection begins. And forgiveness isn't forgetting the pain. It's reclaiming your peace. Healing isn't linear. It's a dance between remembering and releasing. Yet through it all, we grow. Now, I accept that life is beautifully messy. And in that chaos, we find our humanity. To anyone walking their own road, your story matters. Your truth matters. Even in the darkest moments, there is light in you waiting to shine. The path ahead is uncertain, yes, but it's also full of possibility. And that, in itself, is enough.